Okay, we still see lots of people joining in, which is marvelous. Philippines, Abidjan. But we, as always, have a very full agenda, very full hour. So I'm going to start us right off, get us going this morning, even as colleagues continue to join. Let me just begin by really welcoming everyone and so appreciative that you have come to join us today. There's always a lot to update on and these opportunities to engage, even though I wish they were in person, I wish they were one-on-one. These are our opportunity to update. If you would like to hear today's presentation in Spanish or in French, please use the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Also, to remind you that today's session is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the internal CGIAR info point in the coming days for any colleagues who were unable to attend. If during the course of today's session you have any technical problems, please write an email to events@CGIAR and we will immediately seek to help you. So we have about 60 minutes today and a lot of interesting topics to cover. We will speak about the commitments of the senior leadership team following our meeting in mid-April. We had a retreat and what that means for the transition. We'll have a presentation on the global food security crisis and how we as CGIAR are responding, I think, tremendously and in various ways. And we'll speak about the results of the staff survey and next steps from the leadership team, with updates as well on our internal hiring process. We'll also take questions from you as we generally do try and post them in the chat so that we can try to respond to them both in the chat as well as live. We've also taken some time aside, we hope, to answer live questions as well. So let me move on immediately just to frame a bit on the senior leadership team commitments. As many of you know, toward the end of April, the senior leadership team, or the SLT, because everything needs an acronym, we met together for 4 days. Heading into those meetings, we knew that we had reached a very challenging moment in the CGIAR transition. Our external stakeholders had called on us to significantly deepen our engagement with them in the transition. And we were seeing increasing signs of fatigue and uncertainty among our staff. Within the senior leadership team itself, we knew that we needed to strengthen our alignment on the vision for One CGIAR. So these in-person meetings that we had with the SLT working together as a real team have, I believe, really helped us to deepen our understanding of vision and have the frank and extremely constructive discussions that we really need to move forward. So those discussions in that meeting resulted in a set of shared commitments that the senior leadership team as a whole has developed and agreed to. Those SLT commitments were shared in an email that I sent to all of you, which I hope you have received. I'm going to bring in now Tamina Lalani Sharif. She's our regional director, as you know, our regional director for South Asia, in a moment to share her perspective on the commitments and on the next steps that we all agreed to. But just before that, let me address a few of the fundamental points. The senior leadership team remains fully committed to One CGIAR, so the transition continues. Our centers, which were a deep focus of the senior leadership team, are the essential building blocks of One CGIAR. Centers people, partnerships, capabilities, track records of impact are the reason why CGIAR remains so relevant today and why our partners are convinced that CGIAR has an absolutely key role to play in addressing today's biggest global challenges. One CGIAR does not replace centers, nor does it create any sort of a parallel structure that is separate from the centers. Instead, the One CGIAR operational structure weaves together and includes the entirety of all of our centers, alliances, system offices, as well as our group, global and regional groups. It is effectively a matrix structure. So the SLT commitments position us to move forward from a place of more shared understanding and agreement on that destination, this integrated operation of the One CGIAR. We also have to acknowledge that the transition will take time. We recognize that we need to set aside more time to listen and to respond to the needs of our stakeholders and partners. We need to carefully manage this process to ensure continued delivery against existing commitments. And we need to continue to adaptively manage as we go forward, as we learn, as we listen and learn. So we'll continue to move forward in a phased manner, ensuring that you, as well as our partners, are kept better informed and engaged along the way. Let me hand over now to Tamina, who can share her perspective on the readout of that senior leadership team retreat. Over to you, Tamina.
Great. Thanks so much, Claudia. I hope everybody can hear me, and good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everybody. It's great to see so many different people joining from so many different areas. So Claudia and the team asked me to just provide a little bit of a personal reflection on the creation of the commitments and the substance of them. And there's a couple of things that as I was thinking about how to prep for this session, there's a couple of things I'd like to share with you. So the first thought that came to me was that really arriving at these commitments wasn't easy. It was a pretty intense 4 days. I remember at one point Claudia describing what many of us were already feeling in the room as being very raw. There were a couple of pretty tense moments through that time too. And I'll be very honest, there was one point where I wasn't completely sure that we were going to make it to the other side of this. And that was sort of the early part of the week. And then as we started to we've broken things down and sort of been very frank and open with each other, and we started to build these things up. What I really appreciated about this team was the willingness to be that sort of frank and honest, to listen really carefully to each other, and to really appreciate alternate perspectives, and to also clarify sort of points of misalignment or disagreement. And I think that's what really finally got us there. And we ended the week with this really great sense of team, of unity, of coming together. And I've heard from a few of you that really was reflected in the email that went out, in the spirit of the email and the tone. And I want you to know that was really legitimate. It's a different feeling across the team these days. So as we worked through these commitments, we had a really great, stellar support team. And every time that we would work through this and arrive at sort of these aha moments, that support team was there collecting all of these little nuggets. And that's what, when we started to pull this together at the end of the week, that's what became the basis of these commitments. And there's a couple of themes in these commitments and the guiding principles that really resonated with me. So like I said, it came out, that sense of teamwork, that sense of working as an integrated whole to achieve that larger ambition. I feel like that's really resonated in those commitments. Then number 3, the third commitment around being more than the sum of our parts, and using that to sort of tackle increasingly complex global challenges. And that combined with the commitment around listening and responding to the needs of our stakeholders, those two in combination really speak to me, because I'll be quite frank, that's what One CG really symbolizes to me. And it's the reason that I decided to stay involved and to really get involved at a deeper level. And then the last one that really speaks to me as a former, as somebody who's worked in change throughout her profession, is the last commitment. And that's about being change champions. And I think it's so important for not just us as leaders, but for every single person who really is ambitious about One CG to take on that role as change champions. And I'm really glad that we've sort of solidified that in this. And so lastly, before I hand it back over, I'll just say that the other part of this process that I really appreciated is that we didn't stop just at the commitments and the guiding principles, because that's sort of, then comes the harder work. And we kept saying to each other, the devil is in the details. And in fact, what I appreciated was that we actually came away with a Monday morning to-do list. That became sort of our group speak for that. And it's a list of things that we recognize as a senior leadership team that we are going to have to work through. And we're going to have to work through them together and with our individual teams and across teams in order to make these commitments a reality. And we're starting to work through those in the SLT meetings and a set of working groups. But I'll just say that for those of you that have maybe worked with me in the past or are working with me now, you will know how much I appreciated coming away from those sessions with a really actionable sort of hardcore to-do list. And I'm really looking forward to seeing all of this come together. So I'm just going to stop there and hand it back over to Claudia, but just wanted to share with you some of my personal reflections.
Thanks very much, Tamina. And let me thank again the whole senior leadership team and the tremendous staff and teams that helped us put that retreat together. It was really a tremendously important moment for reflection. You know, as we talk about adaptive management, this is what we need to do. We need to take those moments to think through, hear concerns, and really find our way forward together. And that's really what that retreat was all about. So next, let's answer some of the questions on what this means for the transition and for all of you. We'll take some of the questions that you submitted ahead of time, which again, we always really appreciate. And Elwyn, let me turn first to you with a couple of questions on what the SLT commitments mean for the way forward. So one colleague has submitted this question. Has the concept of One CG now fundamentally changed? Does this affect staff affiliation? And what does this mean for center autonomy? So over to you, Elwyn.
Thanks, Claudia. Yeah, and I appreciate that having spoken to many colleagues after we sent that email, that there's many different ways that one can read in between the lines of things, and that there are spaces where people are really looking for greater clarification. That's exactly what we're working on in preparation for another retreat. And a few working groups that have been set up in the senior leadership team, particularly one on roles and responsibilities that aims to really dig down on some of the things I'm about to speak about. So we're hoping we can meet in person again in June. I have to say, just as an aside, I think like many, I got really excited by the idea of a world based on remote working, and less travel and less carbon emissions, etc. Have to say that sometimes you just can't replace in-person meetings, and we've really suffered from not being able to do that during this change process, and that's being addressed really quickly, which is excellent. So back to the question. Look, the destination remains the same. We are still are implementing the transition to One CGIAR. There's not been a fundamental shift in that. If anything, the sense of why we're doing this is just growing over time. Every new crisis, now it's the food price, it's a food crisis, reinforces the need that CGIAR is stronger together. It's stronger as a collaborative, as a collaboration model, where we're able to work really strongly together to address these challenges, which typically don't fall in any one particular subdomain of our skill sets. It's all about working together. What the SLT recommendations or the SLT statement represents is a real shift in how we describe that destination in more detail. As Claudia said, it spells out the centers are the building blocks of One CGIAR. That was also in the SRG's recommendations on One CGIAR. But we hadn't until now articulated what that means in the level of detail required. Specifically, the commitments place much more emphasis on the continuing essential role of centers. We've typically been describing what's new in this model, but what the fundamental of it is that centers are the basis of our existence, and we will continue working with those incredible skills and assets and histories and capabilities. We're just knitting it together or looking at how we weave ourselves together in a much more collaborative model. And in previous communications, just as an example, we'd use the word entities to include centers, the alliance, the system organization, as a way of efficiently doing that. But this, understandably, was perceived by some to suggest that centers disappear. Anything but the case, as Claudia explained. Now, we're recognizing that the structure is a matrix, and that means we need to work through the reality of the One CGIAR, which was always a matrix structure involving centers, involving the operational structure, involving many different skills and capabilities brought into One CGIAR. For example, and now let's talk a bit about the matrix, and there's a working group looking at this that will present far more detail, but just as an example of kind of things we are discussing in the senior leadership team, key decisions that affect center staff, facilities, budgets, it's so important that we ensure that center DGs are involved in this, even once the global and regional groups are up and running. So it's really a decision-making matrix structure that we're going to have to put together and find a way to do that efficiently. And just to give an example, if there is, for example, a shared investment in a, I don't know, genetics laboratory of some variety, that's something we'd need to discuss also from the with the perspective of colleagues wearing their DG hats in terms of the implications on centers of that. But it also involves people. Most staff will continue to have one reporting line to, for example, their unit manager when we transition fully to One CGIAR. But some senior staff, quite appropriately, will have a matrix reporting line into their global or regional group and their DG, who in some cases actually will be the same person. The relative time allocations, the respective roles will vary by position and where we are in terms of the timing of the transition. And that's the kind of level of detail where we need to go cell by cell, group by group, center by center, policy by policy, to look at how we make these decisions in a really effective and efficient way. Which brings me to the great point that was raised on autonomy. One CGIAR is about agreeing to work together much more closely than we've been able to do so far, despite the best intentions of so many staff that have done this. This can and must be achieved in ways that always ensures that centers, through their boards holding ultimate governance authority, their DGs remaining involved in all key decisions, are really able to act in the best interest, given their mandates, governing instruments, host agreements, and legal obligations. The spirit that we saw in the room in the retreat, certainly as I perceived it, I think our colleagues did too from the senior leadership team, was that what we describe as strength is really being redefined in One CGIAR as strength through collaboration, alongside good management practices that delegate to the maximum extent possible. It doesn't mean default decentralization. And through One CGIAR, we can also therefore strengthen the capabilities of our centers through increased investment, more skills development, better services. In that sense, center footprints will expand if we can, if we can accelerate or move forward on our journey towards a 2 billion target. There was a great question in the anonymous question around, isn't this therefore just adding complexity? We believe this is manageable. We believe that through the principles of delegation, team working, we can find actually greater efficiencies and more effectiveness in how we work. If we look at examples of successful communities, many of us work in that context in terms of building the capabilities of communities to manage themselves among smallholder farming communities. We look at the essence of that, and I'm just drawing an analogy here. The success there is having institutions that are capable to embrace the complexity of decision making and to do that in an effective way. We're trying to build the same thing. We're trying to build a stronger society and community across CGIAR, recognizing that for us to deliver on that research strategy in the world where we're working in, deliver in an effective way, we need to be able to work together in a far more profound way than we've simply been able to because of the way we organized and weaved our skills in the past. Lastly, affiliation. This doesn't change the outcome of the initial affiliation of staff to global and regional groups. Going forward, what this means is that we need to recognize that all staff will be operating, broadly in this matrix structure in one form or other, employed by a center or the system organization or an alliance, and delivering that work in the context of this integrated CGIAR way of delivering our business. So look, thanks for the great question. Sorry, that was a rather long answer, and back to you, Claudia.
Thanks, Elwin. Another one of the questions that we have received is about our efforts to strengthen engagement with stakeholders, particularly in the Global South. So let me say a few words about that. We are currently working on a short-term, a very immediate consultation plan to address the strong demand for deeper engagement, particularly with our partners across the Global South. And I see there are also questions in the Q&A about whether we can be open about the various letters and critiques that we're receiving. So yes, we know there have been public letters put out that many of you will have seen, particularly from former staff and stakeholders and leaders of CGIAR about the need for this much stronger engagement. We've heard this from stakeholders in Africa, for example, the leadership of those research institutions. And it's exactly those critiques that we are responding to. We don't mean to hide those critiques at all. In fact, we're engaging quite mindfully to respond. So this immediate effort on the consultation plan really builds on the engagement framework that was released in March. And of course, builds very strongly on the relationships that our centers have built over the decades. So we're looking very immediately to deepen engagement with partners in the Global South to enhance their voice and representation in CGIAR, to strengthen research capacity and catalyze partnerships for impact, and to build our internal capacity and awareness on partnerships with a view to becoming more demand-driven. So this is all very much at the heart of the partnership, the engagement framework that has been led by our partnership and advocacy group. Juan Lucas Restrepo, who can't be with us today, he's at a COP for CCDD in Abidjan this week. And that plan has 4 action tracks. An empowered high-level advisory panel. This is the advisory panel that was announced last month by our system board. Region and country tailored consultation action plans using the initiatives as a springboard. And this is something that our regional directors are working on, helping us use the launch of our initiatives as an opportunity to really engage with stakeholders for their feedback and their input. Using listening sessions as drivers for engagement, really creating the opportunity to hear that input, and really raising internal awareness on the engagement framework itself. So having these discussions with all of you to make you aware of the engagement framework and the intentions for us to invest in these listening and consultation processes. So the high-level advisory panel that the system board announced, they announced the creation, I think the composition of that advisory panel, of that advisory panel will be announced in the coming days. And the purpose of that panel is to enhance the voice of partners across the global South in the CGIAR, and they will help guide our efforts to strengthen our engagement. So they will reflect on and advise on partnerships for impact, where we need to be making our focus, on ownership and shared learning. And they'll help us promote a shared understanding so we can have greater buy-in and shared ownership of the CG mission with our partners. The panel will review our framework and proposed engagement consultation plan, and they'll advise the system board on strategies, approaches, best practices to strengthen research and to catalyze partnerships in countries of the Global South. So really, they will help us both design our outreach and help us ensure that we respond appropriately to what we hear in that outreach. We anticipate that panel will work from this month, beginning the end of this month, through to November. So it's a concentrated period of time to ensure that that input is received even as we are in transition and we can adapt to the good advice that we anticipate we will hear from these engagements. Speaking to the Monday morning to-do list that Nina mentioned, the sort of immediate items on the agenda in this regard are consultations next week in Abidjan. Again, a follow-up of the consultations that are being hosted by the African Development Bank and FARA, the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa, along with all the sub-regional research organizations. We will be having a roundtable on One CGIAR next week in Abidjan, and we anticipate the following week and week thereafter to have a launch and roadshow in South Asia. So we are working very hard to really hit the road immediately and make good on our efforts to engage and hear the input that we need to make One CGIAR a success. Let me stop there and move to our next item on the agenda, which is an opportunity to hear from Jo Swinnen on the work that's being done across CGIAR on the food crisis. If I can turn to you now, Jo.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. It's a bit of a jump, but it is certainly also very much about the CGIAR, where I will be talking about. I'll talk briefly about our work on the global food crisis, which was contributed to by the Ukraine war. I'll review a bit of the analysis of the problem, and then I'll talk about the CGIAR responses and recommendations that have been developed. Let me first say that our initial response has been triggered by the initial questions. And so the initial questions were very much related to the analysis of prices, of markets, or impact on poverty, food security, and the policy responses. And clearly the centers which were most involved, or in a number of ways have been most active in the early days, if you want. So that's IFPRI, obviously, a market analysis, price analysis, poverty, and all in terms of the issues and the policies. CIMMYT has been very active because clearly the cereals were very important in this field, and they're very knowledgeable about all the issues related to that. And ICARDA has been active because the region most affected directly right now by the Ukraine crisis has been in the Middle East and the ICARDA region more broadly. I say I've worked closely with Bram Govaerts and with Ali Abu Saba on this, and so what I'm going to present is also reflecting some of their work. For example, some of the headlines of some of the op-eds that you see there are actually coming from CIMMYT researchers. We have had a tremendous amount of media attention for the work that we have. We were really early on the ball, if I would say so, and this has been reflected in a massive amount of media taking up our analysis and our work. Next slide, please. Just to give you a further piece of a feeling about how important this is that these are data from IFPRI only. And so we've had a couple of policy seminars now on the issue. We've had more than around 500 live attendance at these special events. We now have 17 blogs out in this relatively short period, some of them focusing on the global analysis, some on the fertilizer market, vegetable oil markets, and some of them on country studies. For example, last Friday, we had a piece on Lebanon, and before we had pieces on West Africa, on Egypt, Yemen, Sudan, Bangladesh, etc. So you see the download on Monday was 44,000. I think we are probably close to 50,000 by now. Next slide, please. What is important is that these are the short run effects, if you want, okay? But in the longer run, I should emphasize this, I think all the centers of the CGIAR can play a very important role. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. Food security, obviously, is a very broad issue. And the short run effects, which are focused on the cereals markets and the vegetable oil market, will certainly spill over in other commodities. And also clearly the issue goes beyond the commodities which are currently affected and the regions which are currently directly affected to a much broader part of the world. So there is a lot of work that we have to do together. We are working right now on a note where we have combining both our short-term effect recommendations analysis with the longer-term contribution that CGIAR can make, and we are getting input from all the centers on that. The note itself is organized around 7 action points, and I will end my presentation here with referring to those. I should also mention that our medium and long-term responses are very much in line with which is in the 2030 research and innovation strategy of the CGIAR. So it's very much coherent what we wanted to do anyhow. It just is more urgent and more important, I would say, than even when we wrote the research and innovation strategy. It just adds to the urgency of the whole approach. In this slide, in terms of analysis, what we see is that even before the Ukraine war started, food prices were very high from a historical perspective. On the left-hand slide, you can see the yellow line is the real prices, so that's the one we should be looking at, the ones which are corrected for inflation. And you see that the current prices are actually above the high prices of the food price crisis, as we called it, in 2007, 2008, and even to the ones which were in the early 1970s as a consequence of wars in the Middle East. So it's really exceptional. And so the trigger which has been pulled, if you want, the push that comes from the Ukraine war is just adding to something which was already quite problematic. The other point is that the stocks actually are lower for most of the cereals than they were during the 2007-2008 crisis, and that adds to the problematic situation. The exception is rice, because in the rice market, the global stocks are significantly higher than that. Next slide, please. The impact is, as I said, will spill over across commodities and across regions, but in the immediate effects are concentrated in the cereals, and particularly barley, maize, and particularly wheat markets, and in the sunflower and the sunflower oil market, for which both Russia and Ukraine are major exporters. Together, they're both representing roughly 6% of the global market in sharing calories, so together 12%, which is really very sizable. Next slide. Just like the impact is heterogeneous across commodities, it's also heterogeneous across regions that are affected. I already referred when I talked about Icarda and the MENA region, and you see it in this slide that it's North Africa and Northeast Africa, which are particularly sensitive because they are importing a large share of their calories from Russia and Ukraine. Also, Central Asia is significantly affected, and the region, kind of the Siwana region, if you want, from the new regional groups as we have them. On the right-hand side, you see that these are very recent data in terms of price development, that the price jump has flattened out in recent weeks, and that the green line is for rice, and you see that the rice market is quite different actually from the wheat and maize market. And that's of course important when we think about so many people in the world, poor people who are consuming rice. Next slide, please. In the medium run, and medium means next year and the year afterwards, okay, we expect that the impact potentially of the fertilizer and the fuel prices will be even more important than the current impact through the commodity markets directly. And that is because Russia and Belarus is not directly involved in the conflict, but is also suffering from sanctions which have been imposed on them by a number of countries, which also affects their fertilizer exports. And so both of these countries are very important fertilizer exports. And you see there that the regional distribution of country affected by it are different from the cereal markets affected. And that the sub-Saharan Africa, particularly across Central Africa, and also some of the Latin American countries are very sensitive to these restrictions in export. Fuel prices will probably play a very important role as well, because we know that the difference between the consumer price and the producer price, the farm price, if you want, is fairly substantive, even in lower middle income countries. And their fuel is a really important factor driving up prices for the consumers. Next slide, please. This slide kind of summarizes the price evolutions for food, fuel, and fertilizer over the past 20 years. And the first factor there is that if you look at this, okay, when we talked in 2007, 2008, we talked about a price shock or a price crisis because of a price shock. We see now that there's been tremendous volatility over the last 20 years. So the idea that the jump in prices is something abnormal in a normal situation of stability does not seem to be the reality anymore. And so fluctuations seem to be the norm. And so that has to make us think about how to deal with that, how to deal with food systems where fluctuation, where high volatility is a standard component. We are also worried that the high prices currently are actually more challenging even than the ones in 2007, 8, and 11, 12, for a number of reasons, because it's really adding as a third factor to consecutive problems or worsening of the food security situation. Hunger and malnutrition were on the rise even before COVID, since 2015 roughly, and COVID has really enforced that. So there's been a worsening of food security across the world because of COVID. And this is now adding a third factor or a third component, if you want, a sequence on that. So this not only affects people's capacity to respond to buying nutritious food, but also the government's capacity to respond, because they have been spending a lot of their budgets on COVID responses. We don't know how long this is going to last, so this is contributing to the uncertainty in the market. Next slide, please. Here is a summary of the responses and the recommendations, kind of a mixture of both. I think some of these responses we can play a very important role. Others are more in terms of government and international institutions. This responses that have to be done, where we can play a role in basically making our recommendations based on evidence, make them strong and convincing. And so we have a mixture of short-term responses having to do with real-time measurement, policy analysis, early warning systems, which are really important. The targeting of the short-term responses should be both on the supply side and on the demand side. On the demand side, the expansion of social protection and humanitarian programs is obviously crucial. We have to rethink the use of food commodities for non-food purposes, like biofuels. A very important set of recommendations has to do with governments not making things worse. Okay, and so one example is that export restrictions are being introduced around the world now by many exporting countries, and we know from the past that this is really the wrong response to it. It makes things worse rather than better, and so we have to step in here and show with our analysis that this is not the right thing to do. Then environmental initiatives in several countries, actually, countries are reducing or thinking about stepping back on some of the major environmental policies they introduced to reduce, to make the agricultural system more sustainable. And so we really have to be careful on doing that. I mean, because of the long run trade-offs, I think, in sustainability. And then the last point, which really immediately affects all our funding, is to invest in research and innovation in a number of fronts, always dealing with productivity, with climate change, with resilience factors, etc. I'm going to stop here in the interest of time. I'm happy to share or note to everybody who's interested with more details, but I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Yo. I think that this presentation is not only interesting to all of us, but it really underscores the magnitude and the urgency of the work that we're doing. I think it also helps to underscore, watching how carefully, how closely Yo and Bram and Ali and all of their teams are working together, just how tremendous the impact of a coordinated CGIAR response can be. In each one of our meetings, we ask you what you're most concerned to hear about. And each time we hear from you that the issues of job security and the recruitments are top of mind. So we have Fiona coming up next to update you on those issues. Let me say in queuing up her discussion that we have reason to celebrate the launch of all of the initiatives and the hiring processes that we're going through. Let me underscore the fact that all of the initiatives are moving forward and fully funded. And that's a tremendous achievement of our initiative teams, of our science leadership, of our resource mobilization colleagues, and it's really very exciting. You know, months ago, the great worry was that we would have tremendous disruption or contraction as we moved between the CRPs into the new initiatives portfolio. And in fact, we're moving forward with real strength into this new agenda, not just moving forward strongly, but with really some growth. and that's very exciting. So we have met some very difficult deadlines. There were some question and answers around the urgency. A lot of that urgency was specifically to make this transition, which we have met, and it's very exciting to see us now staffing up the structure that will deliver these initiatives and to see these initiatives launching again, fully funded and with real strength. Let me turn now, though, to Fiona to talk to you about where we stand in the Pulse survey and hiring and recruiting practices. Over to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much. And hello to everyone. It's lovely to be with you all today. As Claudia said, I'm going to drop in to give you a little bit of information and update on the staff survey results. You will, of course, all remember our recent workforce pulse survey, which was held between the 7th of March to the 3rd of April, so over a period of about 4 weeks. This was our second survey, and it was made available in Arabic, Bengali, English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And you'll have noted that these surveys are now part of our regular outreach across our global workplaces to make sure we understand how we're doing, and also to make sure we understand how we're all feeling about the transition and experiencing our workplaces in this time of change. So as usual, we used an external provider to conduct the survey. We, of course, want to make sure that we've got confidentiality and anonymity built into the process so that respondents can be sure they can express their thoughts in confidence. The additional benefit of using an external provider like Agenda Consulting is that they have a long-standing relationship with the majority of CGIAR centres. And so they bring two strong benchmarks against which we can compare ourselves. The first benchmark is data from individual centre staff surveys over the period of about 2017 to 2021. So in addition to being able to track our own progress over those years, we also have the benefit of a comparative analysis against a range of other organisations in the mission-driven and non-profit world, giving us a good external benchmark against which we can measure ourselves too. So for this survey, we had a response rate of 41%, which was a very similar level of response to the June 2021 survey. As is normal, we had a substantial variation in response rates across centres, ranging from 32% to 77%. But largely the findings of the survey were consistent with the findings of the June 2021 survey. So what were those findings? Well, a first critical check-in point has to be engagement, because engagement describes the level of enthusiasm and dedication we're feeling towards our individual work and our workplaces in general. It's a really good barometer for indicating how people feel in terms of job satisfaction and sense of overall morale. So I'm happy to share that the overall engagement in CGIAR remains a point of celebration, just showing the commitment everybody continues to have to the important work that's being done. 79% of respondents would recommend CGIAR as a good place to work, and 74% feel that we have a positive future, which is fantastic to see. Now, while these numbers have dropped somewhat since 2021, they are well ahead of our wider benchmark. And considering we're all working through a time of significant change with the inevitable stress and challenge and sometimes lack of clarity that we're finding, this is a very positive result. So in the next slide, you'll see a second really important touch point for us in this transition. It has to be about our well-being. As you can see from this slide, 82% of respondents feel that their contribution is valued, and 80% feel that they're being provided with the support and the tools they need. So respondents have told us we're on track in these two important areas. But in two other areas, we can see that we have work to do. Now, in this traffic light system, blue is used whenever positivity is 50 to 70%. And as you can see from this slide, 2/3 of respondents say they have a good work-life balance. Now, while this could be seen as being a good result in this time of change, I think it's really important for us to recognize that we do have parts of our population which we know are feeling the heavy lift of work related to the transition. From the focus groups, from general discussions with staff, from these meetings, from the Menti polls, we know that well-being is a concern for many. including those who've been involved in getting our exciting initiatives off the ground, as well as those staff who are supporting this exciting work. We also know that the increasing global nature of our work is causing long hours for some, as we're seeking to join meetings with folks in different parts of the world. So while it's great to see a blue result here, we absolutely cannot take this for granted. We need to disaggregate further and make sure that well-being is an area we continue to focus on. The last point on this slide, I think we need to highlight it, is the amber square. The orange square is where positivity is less than 50% or negativity is greater than 20%. Now, this is about job security, which Claudia mentioned earlier. As we can see, 55% of respondents feel that their job is secure, with 25% saying they're unsure or 20% being concerned. Now, while this result is similar to 2021, and it is ahead of the wider benchmark, it is noticeable that this theme just continues to be raised, not only in the discussions we're having with people, but also in open questions. Now, at a time of change, we could say that anxiety around job security is something that we would expect to see. Change is concerning for many people, but while there have been statements around the need for us to retain the excellent talent we have, there's a tremendous amount of work in making sure that we're inclusive, we're bringing everybody into the operating structure. It's fully understandable that such words might not help reduce anxiety for some people. And it could be argued that, concerns on job security are unlikely to be significantly reduced until we've reached the end of the process, until we've brought everybody into the operating structure, which we know is a complex and a time-consuming exercise. But this is a really clear sign. It's a really clear sign we need to push on, we need to deal with this complexity, we need to drive past the challenges, we need to get right into the detail and work to reduce this orange. So in the next slide, we're looking at our journey to One CGIAR. And as you can see from this slide, we're doing relatively well. 67% of respondents believe that One CGIAR will make our work more impactful, and a majority of respondents feel that they can clearly explain why we're coming together as one. In the open questions, there were also a number of positive comments about initiatives and about structural changes. And as we can see, while we're still in the greens and the blues here, and we're still ahead of our international benchmarks where they are available, it's clear that we definitely can continue to do better. In the next slide, it brings me to an important topic, which is about change management and communications. And as you can see from this slide, 3/4 of respondents feel that they are being kept informed of what's happening in the transition. So overall, while we are seeing quite a lot of blue here, we can see that, again, there is work to be done. In particular, we can do better on internal communications, and we can do better on making sure that staff voices are truly heard. While 55% of respondents feel that they have sufficient opportunities to feedback on the transition, which is similar to 2021, only 44% feel that their ideas and opinions are listened to, which is just simply not good enough. In partnership with Director Generals and Centre People and Culture Leads, and of course our great colleagues in communications, this must be a key area of work for us for the remainder of 2022. We have to find additional ways to hear staff voices and to make sure that perspectives are being better woven into the actions that are being taken. So in my final slide, now we have this data. What do we do with it? What's next? Well, we're working through the very rich feedback we've received, not only in the data I've just shown you, but also in the open questions. And the responses to the open questions are really very valuable in giving us additional insights on these top level figures. It's really good to hear respondents say in those open questions that they feel that the recruitment and the appointment of senior staff and that the staff affiliation process is being well handled, for example. But it's also worth noting that across the centres, staff who have self-identified as female are on average 5% less positive than men. It's also notable that more senior staff, especially those on contracts categorized as international, and those who are aged 55 and over were also less positive. So these are two demographics we really need to target a lot more and listen a lot more to in the coming months ahead. 2/3 of respondents believe that action will be taken as a result of the survey, and so we absolutely must honor and respect that trust. In terms of next steps, the disaggregated results by centre are being shared with each centre so they can focus on those areas that are particular to their workplaces. And across CGIAR working group is convening to provide an early draft response for discussion with the wider senior leadership team to tackle exactly some of those points that I've just raised. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. You're speaking to issues that are very much on the mind of all colleagues. And so let me follow up with one of the questions that we have received recently related to this question to you. We've seen relatively slow progress in jobs and initiative assignment processes in the last few weeks. Is there something to worry about?
Let me unmute myself there. Muting and unmuting. Thanks for this really good question, and let me cover both the jobs and the initiative assignments. And let me start with the recruitment of phase 3 and phase 4 roles in the new operating structure, which I'm really pleased to share is proceeding well. So overall, internal interest in the roles has been strong. So for example, we've had 355 internal applications for the 37 positions that are currently under selection. And we've got 2 more roles coming up for internal advertisement very soon. 36 of these 39 positions are phase 3 roles. And what does that mean? Well, that means that we're 67% of the way through the phase 3 group, which is good progress. And you'll have seen that the phase 4 roles are now also starting to be advertised. I'm really happy to say that our prediction that most of the senior positions can be filled internally is holding strong, with only 4 of the 37 roles moving to external competition. And that just validates the amazing talent we have. It's lovely for me to be able to share that. It's also great for me to be able to share that successful candidates are showing really good diversity. So we're around 37% women so far in phase 3. We've got nice geographic diversity, and we've also got nice diversity coming from across centres. So we've got the first batch of successful candidates, which we hope will be announced this month, following, of course, discussion with Centre Director Generals. And as internal talent begins to transition to these roles, we must, of course, bear in mind the importance of centre business continuity. We've got a new role called Business Partner People Planning that's being created and coming on board on the 16th of May. And that person will be fully dedicated to make sure that any centre's potential capacity gaps are quickly identified and that we get in place practical solutions to bridge them. So as you can imagine, it's a really resource-intensive exercise. It's requiring a lot of significant input from the internal people and culture community who are supporting the global, regional and senior directors, not only in the creation of the job descriptions, but are also being called upon to support the administration in the final stages of appointment, in addition to their centre duties. So although you may not have heard anything in the past couple of weeks, we've got hopefully some great news coming soon. And I'm happy to say that we're moving at pace on that side. On the subject of opportunities and initiatives, I'm pleased to say that after a relatively slow start early in the year, where quite honestly, we were playing catch up, we're now getting up to a good speed. We have a number of initiatives whose full people plans have now been approved, and several more plans who are in final stages of review. Now, when I say we're playing catch up, I'd like to share that our professional support functions have really had to build the ship while sailing it in recent months. We're doing everything for the first time in this exercise. And as with everything, the first time you do things for the first time, it takes a little longer than you'd hope. And we're having to learn lessons along the way. Not having had a dedicated unit set up to support the people resourcing of initiatives, for example, was an early challenge. We were very grateful to have volunteers step in to help us collaboratively design those processes and those new ways of working. We've also had to operate huge volume at the fastest possible speed to make sure that we meet the goals of ensuring that we have robust people plans for all the initiatives, and that we also find ways to both respect the extremely hard work of those who contributed to the initiative design, as well as making sure that we stay true to the commitment for openness and transparency when we're sharing opportunities. So as we go, we're streamlining as much as possible. We're also respecting the new matrixed way of working and the need to make sure that we involve all of those people who need to be involved in the approval processes. And at the same time, we're trying to make sure that everybody who serves on an initiative is recognized for the time they're spending on the initiative. So putting all that together without the tools, it's not an easy feat, I'm sure you can imagine. But with huge thanks to many colleagues, we've had lots of really helpful constructive feedback. We're increasingly moving away from manual and email-driven processes and towards much more efficient ways of working. And one example of that is the sharing of opportunities through the InfoPoint site, where we've seen many hundreds of those opportunities posted in recent months. We're also scoping out the building of an online tool to even further increase that approval speed and to ensure that everyone who submits an expression of interest gets a timely response. And I know that's something that's very important, and I know it's been highlighted in the chat. We're building the extra capacity to address that volume of support needed. So we've 2 new initiative coordinators coming on board on the 1st of June to bring those extra hands and making sure that their duty stations will allow us to better cover all our time zones. And referencing back to Nina and Elwyn's points earlier on the outcomes from the senior leadership retreat recently, we now have an SLT working group on people, and one of their goals is to see how we can make those approval processes even more streamlined and get those decisions out to you even faster. So wrapping up, thanks for your patience with that long answer. I wanted to reassure you there is no need to worry. We are, getting up to speed. We're making progress and we're refining along the way as we respond to the feedback. Just a huge thanks to everyone who's brought their skills and their great constructive feedback to make it all happen. And lastly, if any of you have a particular concern, if you feel anything stuck, please do feel to reach out and we'll certainly be happy to see how we can help. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. And thanks to all of the people and culture teams across the system who are working very hard under very difficult circumstances and such a major transition to ensure the transparency and clarity that we all need. So I am hoping to finish on time. We're right at the top of the hour, but let me briefly answer one more very candid question that has been submitted. Someone has written, why did it take more than 2 years to figure out or learn that things were not headed in the right direction? And let me say that I believe things are headed in absolutely the right direction. The direction is a more impactful, influential, and efficient CGIAR that builds on it and includes all of our centers, the alliance, the system organization. That's where we're headed. What is really changing and what will continue to change is as we adapt in the how we get there, exactly what it looks like, as we drill down into the devil in the details of operationalizing such a profound transformation. That's what changes. And it'll take 2 years, it'll take 3 years, it'll take 4. This is the way we evolve institutions, by having the commitment to hearing what needs to change and the humility to make those changes as we hear them, as we move forward. And I think that that's actually just a very, very important point, that we will continue to learn and change as we move forward. And a very important part of that is hearing from all of you. So we will end, as we always do, with a Menti poll for those of you who can give us another minute. We heard very clearly in the staff survey that people don't necessarily feel that they are being heard. We are trying in these all staffs and our newsletters and the open Q&As and the anonymous Q&As that we make available. But let us, in this Menti poll today, if we can bring that up on screen, team, ask how would you prefer to share your thoughts? Is there a better mechanism that we can put in place? I'm not yet seeing the Menti poll up on my screen. Hopefully we can get that done. How would you prefer to share your thoughts? Is there a better way, a better vehicle or platform for us to hear from you? Because this is something we need to do in order to really adaptively manage the process together toward our more impactful CGIAR. So I'm not seeing that Menti poll. I apologize. Perhaps rather than put it up, there we go. For those of you who can give us another minute, let us know. For those of you with a hard stop, and I know those are many, let me just thank you again for joining us. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak together, to hear from you, and to continuously improve the way in which we are moving forward through this transition. So thanks to everyone, and we will see you next time. Please join the Menti if you can. If not, have a great weekend almost. Take care and thank you. These are great suggestions coming up. Thank you all so much for these. For those of you still on, we are still watching and learning and capturing all of this feedback. So please do continue. These are terrific suggestions. Our team is taking note, and we really, really appreciate the input. Okay, we've captured our Menti. Again, thank you so very much, and we look forward to the next all staff meeting. Thanks and be well. And bye-bye, everyone.